There are things I have never written in my formal reports. This is one of them. For 11 years, I served as property archivist for the Vosburg estate in Newport, Rhode Island, a position that required, above all else, precision. My work was documentation, cataloging, cross-referencing, verifying the continued presence of objects whose combined value exceeded the gross domestic product of certain small nations. I was trained never to feel anything about what I recorded. I was paid, not generously, not to. The Vosburg collection occupied the entire east wing of the main residence, 4,200 square feet of climate-controlled gallery space, organized by period, medium, and provenance. Furniture from 3 centuries. Paintings acquired before the families who commissioned them had any idea what they would one day be worth. Silverware that had rested on tables at which presidents had dined. The collection was meticulous in its arrangement, so that I was meticulous in my maintenance of it. Each item had a catalog number. Each catalog number had a corresponding entry in the master ledger. A physical ledger, leather-bound, maintained in parallel with the digital database at the explicit instruction of Eleanor Vosburg herself, who had never trusted anything that could not be held in 2 hands. Eleanor died in March of 2014. By April, I had completed the post-mortem inventory, had verified every item against every record, and submitted my report to the estate attorneys. Everything was accounted for, every object present, every entry correct. By May, something had changed, and no rational explanation has ever satisfied me since. The item in question was a carriage clock. It appeared in the catalogue as Entry 472-B, a French carriage clock, circa 1873, gilt bronze case with enamel panels, white porcelain dial, an original lever escapement movement, acquired by Harland Vosburg, Eleanor's grandfather, during a business trip to Paris in 1911. Appraised most recently at $47,000, though Miles Vosburg, the current heir, had never shown any particular interest in it. The clock was documented in the northeast corner of Gallery 3, second shelf of the freestanding display case, 3rd position from the left. I could close my eyes and locate it from memory. Now, after 11 years, I could locate every object in that collection from memory. On the 14th of May, 2014, I completed my standard bi-weekly inspection. Gallery 3, display case, northeast corner, second shelf, 3rd position from the left, empty. I cross-referenced the entry in the physical ledger, checked the digital database, reviewed the intake records dating to 1911. No notation of removal, no transfer authorization, no loan documentation, no conservation request, no insurance claim pending. The clock had no reason to be anywhere other than where it had been for over a century. I searched the wings systematically, every shelf, every storage alcove, every surface. The clock was not in Gallery 3. It was not in any gallery. I filed a preliminary incident report and notified the estate attorneys that evening. Miles Vosburg was informed the following morning. He seemed unsurprised in a way that unsettled me considerably. Miles Vosburg was 41 years old at the time of his mother's death, and he carried his inheritance the way certain men carry formal clothing, correctly, but without ease, as though the weight of it had never quite conformed to his particular frame. He had spent most of his adult life in Boston, managing the foundation his mother had established, and visited Newport only when obligations demanded it. When I reached him by telephone that morning, his first question was not what I expected, and he did not ask where the clock might be. He did not ask whether I had checked the secondary storage areas, or whether the conservation team had perhaps taken it without filing the appropriate paperwork. He asked, "Which clock?" I described it. Entry 472-B, French carriage clock. Gilt bronze. 1873. There was a pause that lasted long enough for me to notice it. "I see," he said finally. and it was definitely there during the post-mortem inventory. I confirmed that it was. I had documented it personally on April 3rd, photographed it as part of the insurance verification process, logged the photograph with a timestamp. "All right," he said. "I'll come down this weekend. Please don't file anything further until we've spoken." His tone was measured, professional, but underneath it, so there was something I had heard before in wealthy families confronted with uncomfortable inheritances. Not surprise, exactly. More like recognition. The quiet acknowledgement of something that has finally arrived. Something that was, perhaps, always expected. I returned to Gallery 3 and stood in front of the empty shelf for a long time. Miles arrived on Saturday morning. He walked directly to Gallery 3 without asking to be shown the way, which struck me as unusual. In 11 years of service to Eleanor, I had never seen him navigate the East Wing unaccompanied. He stood before the empty display case for perhaps 2 minutes without speaking. His hands were clasped behind his back, and he examined the vacancy with an attention that seemed disproportionate to a missing object, as though he were reading something in the absence itself. Then he turned and looked at the shelf to the left of the case, so the freestanding table against the north wall, where a collection of decorative boxes was arranged in descending order of age. The carriage clock was sitting on the table. I had inspected that table 6 days earlier. I was prepared to say so with absolute certainty, and the inspection photographs would corroborate it completely. The clock had not been on that table 6 days ago. It had not been in Gallery 3 at all. Miles looked at me with an expression that was careful and controlled, and said, "Please update the catalogue's entry to reflect the current location." I told him I would need to note the discrepancy in the incident report, that my documentation of April 3rd placed the clock in the display case, not on the north table, and that the interim inspection photographs recorded its absence entirely. He considered this. "Note it as a cataloging correction," he said. "These things happen with large collections." They do not happen with collections I maintain. I updated the catalogue entry as instructed. Entry 472-B, location amended. North wall table, Gallery 3. Cataloging correction noted. Date of correction entered. My initials beside it, as required. I did not close the incident report. I suspended it, which is technically not the same thing. The suspended report remained in my files, time-stamped, with all original documentation attached. I told myself this was professional protocol, so I told myself a great many things that spring. The clock remained on the north wall table through May and into June. I documented its presence at each inspection, noted its position with coordinates relative to the table edges, photographed it from 3 angles as I did with every item in the collection. It sat there with complete ordinariness, its gilt bronze catching the gallery light in the same quiet way it always had. In the second week of June, when I arrived for a Tuesday morning inspection and found Gallery 3 precisely as it should have been. The north wall table was correctly arranged, the decorative boxes in their descending order, the silver photograph frames, the letter opener collection in its felt-lined tray. The carriage clock was not on the table. I checked the display case. Empty. I checked the secondary storage alcove. Empty. I walked the entire east wing twice, systematically, corner to corner, shelf to shelf. So I reviewed the overnight security footage from the gallery cameras. Nothing moved. Nothing entered. Nothing left. The clock had simply ceased to be present in any location I could document or explain. I called Miles Vosburgh and left a message. He did not return it for 4 days. When he called back, I read him my inspection notes verbatim. The clock's confirmed presence on June 9th. Its confirmed absence on June 17th. To 8 days in which no personnel had entered Gallery 3 outside of my own scheduled inspections, all of which were recorded on security footage showing only myself. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked whether I had told anyone else. I said I had not. "Good," he said. "I'd like to keep this between us for the time being." I told him I understood the desire for discretion, but that the insurance documentation required accurate location records, and that a second unresolved disappearance would necessitate a formal report to the underwriters, regardless of his preferences. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something I've thought about many times in the years since. "Mr. Alderton, my mother left a letter for whoever held your position when this happened." She anticipated it might. "The letter is in the estate attorney's files, sealed with my name and the catalogue number written on the outside of the envelope. I haven't opened it. I was hoping it wouldn't be necessary." I asked him what was in the letter. "I don't know," he said, "but I think we should find out together. Can you meet me in Newport on Friday?" I said I could. I returned to Gallery 3 after the call and stood in the empty room for a long while, looking at the place where the clock had been. The gallery was absolutely still. The collection was exactly as it should be, except for one item, the same one. Always the same one. Eleanor Vosburgh had died on the 7th of March, a Tuesday, between the hours of 2 and 4 in the morning, in the master bedroom of the Newport estate. She was 78 years old. The cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, which was accurate as far as it went, and the estate had been managed with quiet efficiency by the attorneys and the foundation board in the month that followed. I had worked for her directly for 11 years, and in that time I had developed a careful and professional respect for her. She was exacting. She was unsentimental about almost everything. She managed the collection the way she managed her business interests, with complete attention and zero tolerance for imprecision. She reviewed my quarterly reports personally, raised queries when my documentation did not meet her standard, and never once complimented work that merely met expectations. She had, however, told me something once that I returned to frequently in the weeks after her death. It was a February afternoon, 2 years before she died. I had been cataloguing a recent acquisition in Gallery 2, and she had come in to review my progress. We worked in comfortable silence for some time. Then, without particular context, she said, "Some objects remember where they came from, Mr. Alderton. Not the place, the person. And when that person is gone, the object loses its coordinates." I thanked her for the observation and continued my work. She said nothing further. I had interpreted it as one of her occasional philosophical asides. I had not yet understood it as a warning. The estate attorney's office was located on Bellevue Avenue, 4 blocks from the estate, in a building that had housed the same firm for over 60 years. I had dealt with them throughout my tenure. Insurance documentation, acquisition paperwork, and provenance verification. And I knew the senior partner, a man named Garrison Price, well enough to exchange professional pleasantries without warmth. He met Miles and me on Friday afternoon in the conference room that overlooked a small courtyard garden. The envelope was already on the table when we arrived. It was exactly as Miles had described. Cream-colored, sealed with wax, bearing 2 lines of Eleanor's unmistakable handwriting. Miles Vosburgh. Entry 472-B. See nothing else. No date, no salutation. Miles opened it himself. He read it twice before passing it to me without comment. The letter was 2 paragraphs. Eleanor's prose was as precise in private correspondence as it was in business communication, and she had clearly written it with full knowledge that it would eventually be read under difficult circumstances. The first paragraph described the clock, its origins, the name of the Paris dealer, the date of Harlan's acquisition, and details I already knew from the provenance file. The second paragraph said the following: "The clock was given to Harlan by a woman whose name the family chose not to preserve. When it moves, it is looking for her. I have lived with this for 50 years, and I am telling you now because I did not want to, and because it will not stop until you understand what it is looking for. It will not find her. That is the difficulty." Miles drove back to the estate without speaking, and I sat beside him and read the letter a third time, then a fourth, measuring each sentence against what I knew of Eleanor's character. She was not a woman given to metaphor. She did not use imprecision as courtesy. What she had written, she had meant in the most direct possible sense. The clock moves. It is looking for someone. It will not find her. I asked Miles, when we were back in the East Wing and standing in Gallery 3, whether his mother had ever spoken to him about this directly. "No," he said. "Not once. Not the clock, not the woman, not any of it." I asked how long he had known the envelope existed. He thought about this. "She told me when I was 32. She said there was a letter at Price's office with my name on it and a catalogue number. She said I would know when to open it." "And you didn't ask her what was in it?" "I asked once," he said. "She told me it would explain itself when the time came, so she seemed very certain about that." We stood in the empty gallery. The afternoon light came in through the high windows at the angle I had observed 4,000 times, illuminating the dust that drifted through climate-controlled air in slow, purposeless suspension. The collection surrounded us in its usual silence. 4,200 square feet of accumulated wealth, perfectly documented, perfectly maintained. Somewhere in this wing was a clock that had moved twice without explanation. And whatever it was looking for, it had not yet given up. I returned to the provenance file the following Monday. Entry 472-B had a complete paper trail from the Paris acquisition in 1911 through 7 subsequent decades of estate ownership, and I had reviewed this documentation at intake and never had occasion to return to it. There was no reason to look more closely at what had already been verified. I looked more closely now, for the acquisition record from 1911 listed the dealer as Maison Fontaine, a clock and instrument house on the Rue de Rivoli that, according to a brief notation in Harlan's own hand, had been in business since 1840. The notation included a price, 420 francs, and a single word in parentheses that I had logged and never questioned. The word was restitution. I researched Maison Fontaine through the estate's archive of Harlan's business papers. Not a collection I had catalogued, but never read thoroughly. It took me most of Monday and all of Tuesday morning to find what I was looking for. In a letter dated April of 1911, Harlan wrote to his personal attorney in Providence. The letter concerned what he described as a private arrangement regarding the dissolution of a domestic household in Paris, and he had agreed to receive certain items on behalf of a woman who could not legally own property under her own name in France at that time. He had agreed to hold them in trust until arrangements could be made for their return. No arrangements had ever been made. The woman's name was listed once, in passing, never again. Her name was Vivienne Marchand. I found it in that one letter and nowhere else in the Vosburg archive, not in correspondence, not in financial records, and not in the household accounts Eleanor had maintained with such thoroughness, not in any document produced by the family in the 103 years between Harlan's Paris letter and the afternoon I sat in the archive reading room trying to understand what I was holding. She had been erased with the kind of deliberateness that requires sustained effort over multiple generations. Not forgotten, actively removed. The distinction matters. Forgetting is passive. And what had been done here required choices, repeated and consistent, made by people who understood exactly what they were doing. I brought what I had found to Miles that same afternoon. He read the letter from Harlan. He read my notes on the provenance file. He sat with the word restitution for a long while. "She gave him the clock," he said finally. I told him that was my interpretation of the documentation. Yes, that the clock had been Vivienne Marchand's, and that Harland had received it as part of this arrangement, and that no subsequent record indicated it had ever been returned or that any attempt had been made to locate her. What happened to her? I told him I did not know. I had found nothing after April of 1911. He nodded slowly. Outside the archive windows, the Newport afternoon had gone grey and flat, the kind of light that makes distances difficult to judge. My mother knew this, he said. It was not a question, but Eleanor had known. The letter made that clear in retrospect. Not just its content, but its existence. A sealed envelope with a catalogue number written on the outside, left in a lawyer's files against the possibility of exactly this situation. That is not the action of someone who has discovered something recently. That is the action of someone who has carried a specific knowledge for a very long time and has made a deliberate decision about how and when to pass it on. Then I thought about her comment in Gallery 2, 2 years before her death. Some objects remember where they came from. Not the place, the person. She had known what the clock was doing. She had known why. And she had, each time it moved, updated the catalogue with its new location. Display case, north table, display case again. And filed no incident report and said nothing to anyone, and left a sealed letter for whoever came after her. And I've thought about this for years now, and I have not resolved it. There is a version of her decision I can respect and a version I cannot, and I have been unable to determine which version is accurate, which tells me it may be both. What I know is that she carried this for 50 years and chose to pass it on rather than resolve it. What I do not know is whether that was cowardice or grace. Miles called on a Wednesday evening 3 weeks later. That he had been in contact with a genealogical research firm in Paris, he said. One that specialized in tracing family lines disrupted by the particular legal and social circumstances of the early 20th century. They had found a record of Vivienne Marchand in the civil registries of the 14th arrondissement. Born 1871, employed as a private secretary and household manager for a series of wealthy expatriate families between 1895 and 1914, and a residence listed on the Rue des Écoles through 1912, after which the registry showed nothing further. No death record located, no emigration record, no subsequent address. She simply stops, Miles said. The researcher said that's not uncommon for women in her position during that period. Her household staff who became inconvenient had very limited options for establishing a legal identity once their employer chose not to support it. I asked whether Harland Vosburgh had been among her employers. A pause. There's a reference in the employment registry to a household managed for an American businessman, 1898 through 1911. The name recorded is a francophone rendering that could be a transliteration of Vosburgh. 13 years, since she had managed his household in Paris for 13 years before he returned to Rhode Island and left her behind with nothing she could legally claim. He had taken the clock. He had promised restitution and provided none. And for over a century, the clock had been marking his failures in the only language available to it. I sat with this for a long time after hanging up the phone. There is a particular kind of silence in a collection when you understand, suddenly, the provenance of something you have been maintaining without question. I had documented entry 472-B for 11 years, its dimensions, its condition, its appraised value, its location on a shelf in a temperature-controlled gallery. I had treated it as an object. I had never considered what it had been before it became an object. Before it was entry 472-B, it was someone's. Before it was Harland Vosburgh's acquisition, it was Vivienne Marchand's possession. Before it sat in a Newport gallery for a century, it had sat in a Paris apartment, and someone had wound its mechanism and listened to its movement, and had then given it to a man who promised her something and did not deliver it. I went back through my inspection photographs. 11 years of bi-weekly documentation, the clock in the display case, the clock on the north table, the clock returned again to the case. every photograph time-stamped, every position noted, and a complete record of its movements that, read as a whole, looked less like a cataloguing history and more like a record of persistent, patient, insoluble searching. I had been so focused on the anomaly, the disappearances, the reappearances, the impossibility of its movement, that I had not paused to ask what a clock would be looking for in a Newport mansion in 2014. It was not looking for Vivienne Marchand. She was gone. Miles's researcher had found no death record, but she was gone. It was looking for what had been promised. Miles flew in from Boston on a Thursday morning in September. He came alone, without his usual assistant, and he carried a folder of documents that he placed on the table in the archive reading room without explanation before sitting down across from me. I looked at the folder but did not open it. He said, "I've been trying to determine what the appropriate response is, what obligation, if any, the estate has. Whether there's a legal dimension or whether this is entirely a matter of personal conscience." I told him that in my view those were separate questions that might have different answers. He agreed. He said the legal dimension was, practically speaking, foreclosed. The individuals involved were dead. No living claimant had been identified. The statute of limitations on any conceivable recovery claim had expired many decades ago. His attorneys had confirmed this. "But my mother knew," he said. "She knew what the clock was. She knew where it came from, and she left it in the collection. She maintained the collection. He stopped. He looked at his hands. She was very precise, very thorough. If she knew and she kept it, that was a decision." I said nothing. "I'm not sure I can make the same decision," he said. He opened the folder then. Inside was a document from the Paris genealogical firm, and beneath it a series of pages he had printed and annotated in blue ink. And he had found a descendant. Her name was Isabelle Renaud. She was 63 years old. She lived in Lyon. She was Vivienne Marchand's great-granddaughter through a daughter born in Paris in 1913. 2 years after Harland Vosburg had returned to Rhode Island with the clock and the promise of restitution, and nothing else. The genealogical researchers had traced the line carefully. Vivienne had not disappeared into nothing. She had moved, changed her name informally, so rebuilt her life in a different arrondissement with the methodical persistence of someone who has learned that survival requires being difficult to find. She had raised her daughter without assistance. The daughter had raised her own children. The line continued. Isabelle Renaud had no knowledge of the Vosburg family. She had no knowledge of a carriage clock, a Paris arrangement, or a promise made and broken in 1911. She was a retired school teacher. She kept a garden. She had a daughter and 2 grandchildren. Miles showed me her photograph from the genealogical report. A gray-haired woman in a garden, looking at something outside the frame of the image with an expression of mild and undemanding attention. I looked at the photograph for a moment and then looked at the folder and then looked at Miles. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "I'm going to return the clock," he said. "And I'm going to explain to her, as clearly as I can, what it represents and how long it has been held, and I'm going to ask her what she would like to do with the knowledge." He paused. "And then I'm going to update the catalogue accordingly." I processed the removal of entry 472-B on the 14th of October, 2014. The documentation was thorough, as all my documentation was thorough. I noted the circumstances of the transfer with as much precision as the circumstances permitted, as which was less precision than I would have preferred, but more than the situation perhaps deserved, given how thoroughly it had been obscured for the century preceding. Reason for removal. Provenance research determined original ownership. Transfer to rightful heir. I packed the clock myself. Acid-free tissue, padded casing, a climate-controlled shipping container arranged through the insurer. I photographed it before packing, noted its condition as excellent. Movement intact. Oak enamel panels undamaged. Gilt bronze case with the minor patination appropriate to its age. It was exactly as it had always been. Exactly as it had been on the day I first catalogued it 11 years earlier, and on the day Harland Vosburg carried it from Paris in 1911. 103 years in a family that had received it in bad faith, and it showed no damage from the weight. I sealed the casing and labeled it with Isabelle Renault's address in Lyon. Miles had spoken with her by telephone the previous week. The conversation had taken a long time. He had not told me everything she said, and I had not asked. I carried the casing to the shipping company myself. I did not delegate this. Standing at the counter, watching it move down the intake conveyor, I felt something I could not immediately name. Gallery 3 was quieter after the clock was gone. That is not a precise observation. The gallery had always been quiet, the collection maintained in near complete silence by a climate control system designed to eliminate vibration, and the absence of one item among several hundred should not have changed the acoustic character of the space in any meaningful way. And yet, I noticed it during my next inspection, and the inspection after that. A quality of attention in the room that felt altered, as though something that had been listening had stopped listening. As though a persistent, a patient presence had simply and completely withdrawn. I documented this in my personal notes, not the official inspection record. It did not belong in the official record. There was no field for it. In November, Miles called to tell me that Isabelle Renault had received the clock. He said she had cried, which surprised her since she had no particular emotional connection to an object she had never seen, from a history she had not known. As he said, she had placed it on the mantelpiece in her living room in Lyon, and had sat with it for a long time. He said she told him it felt like something returning. He did not elaborate on what he meant by that, and I did not ask him to. There are interpretations that do not improve with examination. I returned to Gallery 3 the following morning and stood in the space where the display case stood and looked at the second shelf, third position from the left, empty as it should be, and finally, correctly, irrevocably empty. The catalogue required updating. I removed the suspended incident report from my files and closed it with a notation referencing the provenance transfer. I updated the master ledger, the physical one, leather-bound, the one Eleanor had insisted upon maintaining in parallel with the digital database because she trusted what could be held in two hands. Drawing a single line through entry 472-B with my pen, I wrote beside it, transferred. October 14, 2014. Rightful heir located. I sat with the open ledger for several minutes after completing the notation. Eleanor had maintained this ledger for decades before I did. Her handwriting was in these pages, precise and upright, recording acquisitions and movements and occasional removals over the years of her stewardship. I'd always read her entries as the documentation of a careful and responsible collector. I read them differently now. She had known what the clock was doing. She had known why, and she had, each time it moved, updated the catalogue with its new location. Display case, north table, display case again. And filed no incident report and said nothing to anyone, and left a sealed letter for whoever came after her. I have thought about this for years now, and I have not resolved it. There is a version of her decision I can respect and a version I cannot, and I have been unable to determine which version is accurate, which tells me it may be both. What I know is that she carried this for 50 years and chose to pass it on rather than resolve it. What I do not know is whether that was cowardice or grace. Miles sold the Newport estate the following spring. The decision was not related to the clock as far as I could determine. The foundation's operational needs had shifted. The property required significant investment. The practical calculus of large estate ownership had simply resolved against him. Saying these things happen with inherited properties. The math eventually asserts itself. I was retained through the sale process to assist with collection documentation, which meant spending 4 months preparing transfer records for items going to auction, to museum loans, to private buyers, and to permanent storage. It was the most thorough cataloging work I had done in 11 years, and I approached it with the particular attention of someone who now understood, concretely, so what incomplete documentation could conceal. Every provenance file received a full review. Every acquisition record was traced to its origin where tracing was possible. I found 2 other items whose histories I could not satisfactorily establish and noted them accordingly in the transfer documentation, with recommendations for further research by the acquiring parties. I did not find anything else that moved. On the last day of my work at the estate, and I walked through Gallery 3 one final time, the cases were empty, the walls were bare. The climate control system was still running, maintaining the temperature and humidity of a room that now contained nothing worth preserving. It would be shut down the following week. I stood in the northeast corner beside the empty display case and looked at the second shelf, 3rd position from the left. The light came through the high windows at the angle I had observed thousands of times, so the absence was ordinary now, which is what absence should be. I left Newport in June of 2015. Private archive work is a small profession, and positions at the level I had occupied with the Vosburghs do not become available frequently. I spent 4 months consulting before accepting a position with an estate in Connecticut. A different family, a different collection, a different set of silences to learn. I brought my methods with me, the bi-weekly inspections, the parallel documentation systems, the photographic records with timestamps, the attention to position and condition that had defined my professional practice for decades. I also brought the habit, which I had not previously had, of reading provenance files thoroughly rather than verifying them. There is a difference. Verification confirms that a document exists and that the information within it is internally consistent. Reading means asking what the document does not say, thus asking whose name appears once and never again, asking what word appears in parentheses and why. I have not encountered another situation like the Vosburgh clock. I do not expect that I will. In 22 years of archive work across several significant collections, it remains singular, and yet I find I cannot quite return to the professional distance I maintained before it. Objects are not neutral. I knew this intellectually, as every archivist knows it. Provenance matters, context matters. So the history of ownership shapes meaning and value. I understood it as a scholarly principle. I understand it now as something else. Something that does not have a field in the official documentation and that I have not found a precise way to record. But I have not stopped trying. Miles Vosburgh sent a letter to my Connecticut address in the autumn of 2016. It was brief. He wrote that he had been in correspondence with Isabelle Renaud, and that she had told him the clock was still on her mantelpiece in Lyre, that she had learned, through her own research since receiving it, something of her great-grandmother's life and work in Paris, that she had found a photograph. He did not describe the photograph. He said only that Isabelle had told him the clock looked correct on the mantelpiece, that it looked, in her word, returned. He also wrote that he had been thinking about his mother, and about her 50 years of stewardship of something she understood and did not resolve. He said he had decided, after long consideration, that he believed she had intended to resolve it but had not found the mechanism, that the sealed letter was not, as he had initially read it, an abdication. It was preparation. She had done the research. She had preserved the provenance file. She had left the word restitution in Harlan's acquisition record untouched when she could easily have removed it. So she had left everything needed except the final action, and she had trusted that whoever came after her would have, or would find, what she had not. I read the letter twice, and then set it down on my desk and sat with it for a while. It is possible he is right. It is possible she calculated this with the same precision she brought to everything else in her life. I find that I want this to be true. There are questions I still carry. I do not expect to resolve them, and I do not know what moved the clock. I've read, in the years since, about the various frameworks people use to explain such things: field theories, object agency, the persistence of emotional residue in physical matter. And I find none of them satisfying and all of them partially adequate, which may be the most honest position available. The clock moved. It moved without explanation. It moved in a pattern that was, in retrospect, consistent and interpretable. Beyond that, I cannot go. I do not know what Vivienne Marchand's life became after 1912. The genealogical researchers found that she survived, that she built something, that the line continued. What the cost was, what the shape of a life looks like after that particular kind of abandonment, I do not know. The record does not contain it. And I do not know whether Eleanor Vosburgh's stewardship of this situation should be understood as a failure or as a long preparation for a resolution she could see but not execute. I have argued both positions to myself at length and remain genuinely uncertain. What I know is that the clock is in Lyon, that Isabelle Renaud placed it on her mantelpiece and found it correct there, that something that had been looking for over a century stopped looking. Whether that constitutes an answer to the question the clock was asking, to the question Eleanor left sealed in a lawyer's office, to any of it, I cannot say with the precision my profession requires. I have noted it in my personal record as unresolved. I retired from private archive work in 2021, 26 years after I began. The collections I maintained over that time are documented with completeness, every object accounted for, every provenance verified or flagged for verification, every incident reported and closed, except one. The suspended report from May of 2014 has remained in my files. I reviewed it before writing this account and found it exactly as I left it. The inspection photographs, the incident notation, the documentation of the clock's first disappearance and Miles's instruction to record it as a cataloging correction. The correction I made in the official record and the truth I kept separately, because some truths do not fit the available fields and cannot be discarded simply because they do not fit. I do not know who will read this or whether anyone will. I'm writing it because the professional record is incomplete, and I've found, in the years since leaving Newport, that I am unable to accept incomplete documentation in my own history, even when the complete version resists the forms that documentation normally takes. The carriage clock, entry 472-B, is in Lyon, France, in the home of Isabelle Renaud, born 1951, retired schoolteacher, great-granddaughter of Vivienne Marchand. It is on a mantelpiece in a living room I have never seen and will never see. As far as I am aware, it has not moved since it arrived, and I have no way to verify this. I find, unexpectedly, that I do not need to. Some things, once correctly placed, hold their position. I've chosen to trust that.